everyone. Today we're joined by Mathilda Mallinson. How are you today?
Hi, dear. I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
That's great. So, just to begin, could you tell our listeners just a bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Matilda, and I'm a journalist and the host of Media Storm podcast. But I began my career working in humanitarian aid in the refugee sector. And then when I went into journalism, it was very specifically to report on immigration in a way that I didn't see it being reported on. So I've tried to do journalism a little bit differently, and I've struggled with that at the beginning, working at mainstream news outlets like the FT and the Evening Standard. And now I've gone independent and set up a podcast with fellow journalist Helena Wadia. It's called Media Storm, and we started with the House of the Guilty Feminist. I don't know if any of you know the amazing feminist activist podcast, The Guilty Feminist, with Deborah Francis White. But we launched with her behind us because it gave us an opportunity to do journalism a little bit differently, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that more on the show today.
That's amazing. So, as a journalist, how has your work allowed you to shed light on feminist issues and stories which are often overlooked in mainstream media?
So I think a really crucial tool in me being able to shed light on issues that are overlooked in the mainstream media is podcasting. Podcasting as a format has allowed Helena and myself to do journalism differently to how we were allowed to do it when we worked at mainstream media outlets. So I previously was trained at the Financial Times, I worked at the Evening Standard, I've written for The Guardian, The New Statesman, The Telegraph, kind of you name it, typically focusing on immigration. But I was frequently frustrated by a reluctance to tell the stories that I thought was important. And the reason I thought these stories were important was because I was hearing from the refugee community that they were important, and they were not the stories that were being told. And so Helena and I bonded over this kind of frustration that we found in our former workplaces. We would pitch stories, they would be rejected, and then maybe a week or two later, we would see them breaking elsewhere. And so if you really want to cut your own path and you want to do things a little bit differently as we did, podcasting was such a brilliant way to do that. You know, anyone can make a podcast. I'm not saying it's easy. Dia will know that herself. But it does allow you to break from convention. And not just in terms of, editorial guidelines, but in terms of creativity and storytelling and long-form nuanced interviews that, again, are very different to the kind of fast-paced 24-hour clickbait news cycle that you get in the mainstream.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I think with podcasts, there is a sense of freedom. I agree it is quite difficult, but there is a sense of freedom and you can kind of speak on whichever manner you would want. And definitely legacy medias and big media companies will definitely just pick what's trending at the moment, and what people will click on, clickbait, as you said, um, rather than the important issues at hand. So, the Media Storm podcast has become a very powerful platform for feminist and humanitarian discussions. Can you share some of your most memorable moments or episodes that have had a significant impact on you and or your listeners?
Oh, well, there's so many. In terms of the impact of the show itself, when Helena and I started, we were doing it really on pennies while working multiple other part-time jobs, and we didn't think that it was going to really have industry impact on the level that we've seen. But after our first season, we won the Best Current Affairs podcast at the British Podcast Awards, and we were shortlisted along with The Times, The Guardian, The Economist, the BBC, taught us, amazing institutions, and we were really quite shocked to be ranked among them, let alone ranked above them. And we think that from the feedback we got from listeners, there are a few episodes that we know really stood out from that first season. Our pilot was with refugees, as I've mentioned. That's an area in which I specialise. We had an episode on sex workers, and my dad was the first to message to say that this had completely transformed his view on the debate around sex worker rights. And this is something that you do see when you put lived experience front and centre, and you have people advocating for themselves and telling stories in their own voices rather than being spoken for by so-called experts or journalists. then you do get a very different side of the story, and you get a very compelling side of the story. And we've really seen, listeners' views change. Probably the starkest example of that, though, and this might surprise you that we did this as a topic, was an episode we did on unoffending paedophiles. This was at the start of our second series. And this was about people who are inflicted with paedophilia as a disorder that develops in people at puberty for a cause of which we do not know. And they never act on it. But they are also unable to access any professional, therapeutic, or medical support, despite that support being scientifically available, because of the legal barriers we have in place and the fact that we only consider paedophilia in a criminal context when it's acted on, and we don't look at it in a clinical context, the far more common situation, which is the millions of people living with it and burying it and not being able to confide in anyone about it, and therefore being far more liable to go down a path in which they or someone else is under threat.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I mean, you guys cover a variety of topics, and your work sheds light on often overlooked stories and voices, as you mentioned a few examples. How do you ensure that your reporting accurately represents the experiences of marginalized communities?
It's a really good question. How do we ensure that our reporting accurately represents the experience of marginalized communities? Because those experiences are so diverse among themselves. One interviewee isn't going to be able to represent the experience of, say, Asian minorities. We did an episode on anti-Asian abuse in the UK. One person's experience isn't going to represent the entire communities. And so one of the first things we really do that is quite different to other shows is we make sure we include a wide range of voices. And this makes editing an episode down to our kind of 45-minute goal quite tricky when you're trying to get that many voices in. But it is really important to us that A, we don't put the burden on one individual to speak up for a whole community, and B, we don't misrepresent that community. I would say it's also to do with the relationship you see between yourself as a journalist and your source as someone from that community. I think that often people with minority lived experience, marginalized lived experience, are looked on as journalists as case studies. And when they're interviewed, they're kind of just asked to share their most traumatic experiences, and those experiences are thrown into the end of an article as a case study. And then it's experts, such as academics or politicians, who are asked to analyze that and create the narrative. Actually, we do it a bit differently at Media Storm. We take the people who have lived experience and we see them as the experts. We don't think that you are a case study because you have direct experience of trauma or marginalization or vulnerability. We think that you are probably best placed to dictate the narrative and define the possible solutions. So we enter into these relationships with our sources from a much more collaborative approach. And I think that also helps to ensure accuracy, because that means the people reading the story who have that experience will look at it and think, oh yeah, that's reflective, that's accurate, rather than thinking, well, this is some sort of wider social narrative that we're just being fitted into that feeds existing stereotypes and preconceptions about our community.
Yeah, I think that's one of the amazing things about your podcast is you get your information directly from the source in most cases, where you have your guests that are speaking firsthand about their experiences and the different topics that you bring up, which is very interesting and very, very new. And like you said, a lot of big media outlets tend to use individual experiences as a little piece of evidence behind their story. But yeah, the way you guys have done it is amazing. And so going back to mainstream media, minority representation in media has suddenly become a topic of discussion. How can journalists ensure equitable representation and break stereotypes while covering minority communities?
I think the key is in the way you phrase that question. Minority representation in media has been a topic of discussion. How to ensure equitable representation and break stereotypes? Well, it's not just about who you put in front of the camera. It's not just about who you interview in the article. It's also about who's behind the camera and who's writing that article. Newsrooms are really undiverse. Yes, in terms of race, and in terms of gender at high levels still. I think one of the things we don't talk about nearly enough is in terms of class. Both Helena and myself, while we have varied experiences of the topics we talk about, come from middle class backgrounds. So I think when we're campaigning for better representation in the media, as well as making sure lived experience is represented, we really need to think about the structures of newsrooms and how we can change that to make sure that diversity is happening inside the newsroom as well as outside it.
Definitely. I think there's so many cases where companies will advocate for equality when you don't see that kind of equality within their organization themselves. So definitely, I think it's a very systemic issue, which is going to be quite hard to overcome overnight. But yeah, definitely, I think it's something to consider. So, in this era of social media and, individuals being able to spread news going viral within seconds, there's an era of misinformation that we're in currently. How do you uphold journalistic integrity and fact checking in your reporting to ensure accuracy and credibility?
Oh, this has been a tricky one for us because obviously fact checking and journalistic integrity are rule number one. Why should anyone believe anything we're saying if we're not even making sure like the basic facts are accurate? But on the other hand, Helena and I are a small team. Not only do we do all of the journalism for every investigation on MediaStorm, we also edit and produce the episodes, and we do the social media, and we do the accounting because we are set up as an independent company and we are on our own PAYE. Yeah, we also have to do the fundraising. And so it's easy when you're trying to do the mammoth task of create a successful independent podcast as journalists that the smaller details might fall through the cracks, and you just can't afford to do that in journalism. So fact checking is quite an exhaustive process. When I work with a mainstream news outlet like The Guardian, I will have someone else rigorously fact checking every detail of what I've said, holding me accountable, asking me to provide original sources. Sometimes it will go through a legal process where lawyers will make sure that the most liable points are especially backed up. And at MediaStorm, Helena and I have to do that ourselves. Obviously, fresh eyes are quite important, and so we will fact check one another's work. Sometimes we have interns, and it's actually a really good process for interns to be involved in. That's what I did most heavily when I was training in journalism and doing internships, was probably the fact checking. But the benefit of a podcast, I would say again, is that these are not live interviews, and so not only can we be accountable for everything that we say, we can also be accountable for everything that our guests say. And we can just make sure that if they make a point that is statistically inaccurate, we can point that out. And if they do say something that's accurate, we can provide the source for that. So also what you'll find on MediaStorm is in our show notes, we actually include the source references for data and contestable facts that we give to the public so that they can hold us accountable for the information we share with them.
It's definitely amazing how you and Helen do it all by yourself. I mean, it's definitely hats off to you. It's amazing. So with your extensive experience in the field, what advice would you give to aspiring journalists who wish to pursue impactful reporting on a number of topics, or perhaps the ones that you have experience in, such as immigration or human rights or minorities?
Oh, there's so many pieces of advice I would give. And maybe the first one is to seek out that lived experience. Let's talk about immigration. That's obviously a topic of interest to your listeners, and that's the area in which I started. Actually, before becoming a journalist, I worked as an aid worker in refugee camps. I worked in South Africa and in France, in Calais and Dunkirk for some years. And what I really learned is that the narrative we were being given through the mainstream media is a fiction. It doesn't line up with the reality for people on the ground. And in fact, their stories are being appropriated to fit an often highly politicized or highly commercial narrative that benefits politicians or newspapers trying to make money by selling as many headlines as possible. So the first thing I would say is to let lived experience lead. This doesn't just apply to immigration. And the lesson that taught me was the knowledge I lack from my lived experience can only be made up by hearing from people with first-hand knowledge. And so I would say, A, keep your mind open, keep your conceptions flexible until you have consulted that range of experience. But on the other hand, have a spine. Don't be afraid to be rigid and to stand up for the values that you do believe in, because you will have to. The industry is not perfect. And if you want to do journalism in a way that you feel holds true integrity to yourself and to all of the issues that we've been discussing today, then you are going to at times have to go against the grain. So I would say know when to challenge yourself and step back from your preconceptions, and know when to back yourself and step forwards.
Yeah, that's some great advice. I think the most important thing is, like you said, confidence. Um, don't be afraid to go out there, to put yourself out there. I think is great advice for anything and anyone, to be honest, not just journalism. But that's amazing. So finally, what are some upcoming projects or stories you're excited to work on, and how can our listeners stay updated on your work and the Media Storm podcast as a whole?
Oh, well, we're on season 3 of Media Storm now, and that's going to run to the end of October. So the next few weeks, we actually have quite a major investigation breaking, and that's to do with racism and sexism within the police force. This is something that has been talked about a lot, but not quantified really. And I have spent months collating never seen before data from police forces all over the country to actually quantify, to provide hard statistical evidence that discrimination exists, and to pinpoint where exactly it is arising. So over the next few weeks, we will be analysing that data with experts and people inside and outside the police to make sure that a really constructive conversation arises from it. We will also have a live show after that. That's in a few weeks. Ooh, and I would really love if any of you could join us. It'll be Saturday, the 16th of September at King's Place, London. It's an evening showing at 7 p.m. and it'll be quite intimate. It'll be a panel. We'll be looking at some of the craziest headlines and how they were reported. There'll be lots of chance for audience engagement and, catching up at the bar afterwards. So do come along to that if you can. And then we'll be wrapping our season with an investigation into resistance fighting and the fine line between terrorism and freedom fighters. So all of that is stuff I'm looking forward to on Media Storm.
That sounds so exciting. There's a lot to look forward to, and I will definitely be looking out for all of them. Thank you so much for your time. I loved your answers. Thank you.